Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca,
And I'm Landon.
and we have a wonderful guest with us today. We have, I'm sure most of you recognize, the incredible Margaret Toscano. How are you today, Margaret?
I'm doing just great. Thank you for having me on again.
Oh, we are very excited to have this conversation with you. This is going to be amazing. Landon, why don't you just briefly read her bio in case there are anybody out there in the known world who doesn't know who Margaret is?
Okay, absolutely. Margaret Toscano has been speaking, writing, and publishing about Mormon feminism since 1984. She is now working on a book about the Mormon Heavenly Mother. She is associate professor of classics and comparative studies at the University of Utah, where she teaches classes about mythology, classical civilization, religious studies, hell, immortality, and all levels of the ancient Greek and Latin languages. She is the co-editor of the book Hell and Its Afterlife, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. She also works on the reception of classical culture and popular media, and is currently working on an article about Hades and Persephone. So,
Wow.
So I'm very much a comparative scholar. I do all kinds of topics, but mostly dealing with, religion, myth, gender. So very interested in anything like that. By the way, whenever I teach my hell class, students just love it. They love signing up for hell, right?
Mom, Dad, I'm going to hell,
I'm
and
going
you're
to
paying
hell.
for it.
College is hell. It's the hell they told me it was.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, I love this, and your background is so interesting, and you're so knowledgeable. We had the opportunity as Mormonish to go on the Backyard Professor along with Margaret to talk about the Gospel Topics essay. I think it's called the Joseph Smith's Teachings on the Temple, Women, and Priesthood. Not necessarily in that in order, but boy, that was an interesting conversation. And we still need to put that out as Mormonish, and we will. You can catch that on BYP's channel too. But we couldn't think of anybody better to come on and discuss this topic with than Margaret. And this all occurred a week or so ago. Landon and I were out of town, so we weren't able to podcast about it. And we watched everybody's podcast. That we're calling it the Great LDS Women's Standoff. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this scenario that was brought to light. The first I saw of it, and I think most of us, was Peggy Fletcher Stack in the Salt Lake Tribune put a big article out that said, did you know that women, LDS women in the Bay Area for a decade or so have been sitting on the stand, as leadership, like you'd see your bishop and your counselors there, didn't seem very obtrusive. They're just on the stand. And then suddenly an area rep comes in and says, that's not going to stand. We're not going to do that anymore. And as I hear it from contacts there, instead of, reading a letter or giving a letter of instruction, they pretty much just said, tell the women that they can't sit on the stand anymore. And when Bishop said, well, is there a letter? Is there something formal I can read? They said, well, if you feel that that's needed, you can write it yourself. So very, no paper trail, just get them down off the stand. We're not really going to try to make this official. But of course, a lot of people had a lot of very strong opinions about this. In fact, if you go to the next slide, I think we have some pictures of, all kinds of media blitz. That's what we're calling it. Everywhere we looked. And we, Landon and I in Florida, were kind of frustrated. We're like, oh my gosh, everyone's podcasting about this. It's going on everywhere. And we, of course, could not at the time, but we got a hold of Margaret right away and said, would you like to come on when we get back? And let's talk about this, because I think there are larger issues. There's a larger picture. And we are really interested to hear your thoughts on this, Margaret. Did you hear about it right when it first happened, or
Actually, I didn't hear about it right when it first happened because I get so busy with my work that I don't follow everything on the
not a
the
church
Mormon
watcher.
media. Right, except for my husband, who's now retired. He's the one who will tell me, oh yeah, did you hear this was happening? And then you guys contacted me, and at first I thought I listened to the great interview that RFM did with Carolyn Pearson, who lives in the Bay Area, and with Lila and Martine. And I thought they did a really nice interview about it. But as I was thinking about it, you guys, well, do I want to come on? I thought, well, I do think I have something to add that will maybe put it in a larger context that I think really shows what some of the underlying issues are here. So thank you for inviting me. This is fun.
Yep, I think it's
Yeah.
going to be good. I can't remember our order of our next slides. Oh my goodness, we've been making so many slides today. What do we have up next? If there's anything we want to cover before we dive right in. I guess I should say that the women in the area, as we understand from different articles and people that have connections, they definitely were very dismayed and disheartened by this. A group organized, you can find them on Instagram, and they're called Women on the Stand, I believe. And they actually put together an open letter to the General Relief Society president and the General Young Women's president, where they just kind of went through in detail their disappointment in what had happened. I don't know do you think we should read the letter, Landon, or do you think we can just kind of paraphrase, basically saying, it's an example to our daughters and our sons to sit there in the audience and see women and men leading together, and so just expressing disappointment. And there's an opportunity to sign a petition. If you go to the next slide, it looks like so far, 844 people have so far signed it publicly and privately. And they're encouraging everybody to read the open letter and then to sign. So again, you can go to Women on the Stand if you'd like to find out more about what they're doing, but definitely a situation where they felt like they had to take action, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if this is limited to just women that can sign it or if men can sign as well. But it definitely.
Oh, I think men should sign it. I
Yes.
think it's really important for men to sign as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to go in and sign this myself because it's important that I think, for everyone who does sign this, that there's many who are saying, is this going to get me in trouble with my stake president if I sign this, and that support it but aren't willing to sign it. So for those of us, especially in the post-Mormon community who still might have records in the church or whatever, that you can go in and sign this and say, hey, I support this. There needs to be a place for the women in the church
and the men. I think it's so important for leaders to know that these issues that do relate to women, that men also care about them, and that men, just because you're a male priesthood holder doesn't mean you agree with what the church is doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
I should also mention, it's funny because I would never sign this, because as soon as my name is on it, they go, oh, that negates the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
There's Margaret Toscano.
That's right. Low profile. Some people have to have a low profile. That's right. So while you may not sign it, we still are extremely interested just to hear your thoughts. And I know that you, if anyone, can put it in a much larger context. Some people that are younger, probably don't even understand, the history or just like the bigger picture. And I think that's where your information is really invaluable.
Yeah, in fact, why don't you did you have the next slide, Rebecca, which was the one of the ordained, no, that's the open letter again. One more. Okay. Oh, here's
here we go.
So this is a photo that I believe was taken in 2013. So I can't believe it's 10 years ago now. That this is a group that were part of the ordained women. And I should tell you that even when this group was started, they debated about whether or not I could be a visible figure, because it was the idea, they were trying to portray the idea. And if you want to look on the Ordained Women's site, which was started up in 2013, and these were women and men who were advocating for ordaining women, trying to do it in a respectful manner, and saying, most of us are active LDS members, but because of our own personal experiences and our reading, we believe that women should be ordained. And then, of course, we did two activities, one at in the April conference 2013, and then one in the October conference, where we marched. Maybe I shouldn't say march, because it sounds too too confrontative, but we were trying to be nice Mormon women, right? I think most of us even wore dresses. And so we went from like that little park, which is east of the tabernacle and the temple. And this is, of course, before all the construction. And we kind of respectfully marched over to the tabernacle, asking for admittance to the priesthood session. And of course, we were denied. And there was national, international coverage there. So it went really viral. And of course, you have Kate Kelly on the left. A year later, Kate was excommunicated. The movement has really sort of gone underground. It lost a lot of, momentum after Kate's excommunication. And I think one of the sad things, and I've seen this again in the history of Mormon feminism, that you'll have a real active feminist activism and kind of outspokenness, and then you'll have certain people that are excommunicated. Way back in the 70s, it was Sonia Johnson with the ERA movement and the church's opposition to that. In the 90s, it was me and other women, high-profile women in the September 6th and so forth, that were exed, feminists that were outspoken. That was one of the target groups for the September 6th purge. And then in 2013, if you think about it, the 70s, okay, then Sonia Johnson is exed, and you kind of have Mormon feminism going underground. Then in the late 80s, when in fact I, along with some others, started a group called suddenly my mind will go blank, but it was the I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, we started a group. We had Counterpoint Conference, and we had other things where we were advocating for women to have more voice and to talk about gender issues. And then you had the September 6th purge, my excommunication, other people excommunicated. And then it kind of goes underground again. And then in the early 2000s, culminating in the ordained women in 2013, Mormon feminism kind of reemerges. It was the Mormon Women's Forum. That was the name I was trying to think of. I'm old. Give me a minute. It will come back
I get
to
it.
me, right? The Mormon Women's Forum was started in 1988. And the whole idea was that there'd been a lot of feminist groups before that, but they were mostly private retreat groups. You did have like the Exponent 2, but there was not like a public forum for discussing issues. So we started in 1988. Kelly Frame and also Karen Christ and the three of us kind of were the initial ones that started it, and have a public forum for discussing. And then eventually that sort of faded along with, excommunications and so forth. And then again, the ordained women movement starts 2013. Kate is excommunicated in 2014. And I really think that in the last 10 years, Mormon feminism has gone underground again.
Yeah.
Things are still happening online, but it's not the sort of really visual activism that we had. So it's really interesting that if you look at this group of us in that picture, I was excommunicated already by that time, of course. So they debated, should we let Margaret participate? Because maybe it'll seem too radical then if she's there. But I did. And then basically now I don't think any of those women are in the church still. I don't know. I haven't talked to Hannah or some of the others, but I mean, that's kind of the movement that we see. So I think it's interesting though with this, I love the idea of the women were asked to stand down and now we have another standoff, right? So we can play on those terms. But
Margaret, do you think,
so I think it's,
do you think the
Go ahead.
do you think the movement went underground because the church gave some leeway? I mean, in one sense, they stopped having priesthood session totally.
Yeah. Well, no, they put it online for a while. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they've put the the young women now. They've lowered the missionary age and called young women on missions. And then you've got these women that were allowed to be on the stand. Was there some headway being made, or do you think it was the excommunications just scared everybody off?
So to me, the question you've asked, Landon, is kind of a central question that I see as pertinent to both the sort of waves of Mormon feminism as well as this current issue. So one of the patterns that we see, and maybe I'll state my kind of strong opinion first of all, I think that the central issue in all of this is the fact that women are not ordained to priesthood. And this has always been controversial among Mormon feminists, okay? But my kind of central thesis is that because women are not part of the priesthood structure, no matter what little changes you make to try to appear that things, to make it appear that things are more equal, the bottom line is that women are second-class citizens. They are not equal. So, and there's been so much discussion about this over the years, that the priesthood structure, and of course, remember back when we had our other discussion about my article, which was a response and a critique to the church essay about Joseph Smith and priesthood and women, that in that article, I bring up the fact that there have been, since in 2019, they've made, in that sort of period of 2019, notice that that's 5 years after the Kate Kelly excommunication, but in 2019, or somewhere around that, I'm not sure it's exact on the dates, they made several changes. They did quite a bit of changes in the temple to kind of create more of equal language. They allowed women to be, and actually children too, like you talked about handing out the towels at the baptismal font. They let women and children be witnesses. And they also said, we're going to include women more. There was a lot of complaints about young women having to confess sins to male priesthood leaders. So they'll say, we're going to have more input of women leaders in regard to young women. And also they have said, well, we're going to include women on in some of the priesthood council meetings. So you have those kind of 4 areas where in that period, they seem to be saying we want more equality. But my critique is that I'm glad to see all of those changes, but bottom line, as long as you have a male hierarchical priesthood structure that is in charge of the church, women are second-class citizens. There is really not an equality. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind here. They give the language of equality, but the structure argues against that. And so you could say, well, I mean, I think for an outsider, they might think, what's the big deal whether women are on the stand or not, right? But it's indicative of this larger question. And just a couple more things, and then I want to hear your responses. It's really interesting. The first paper I ever gave on Mormon feminism was in 1984. I gave a paper about, it was called The Missing Rib. And it was about, the missing rib was women are not part of, I was using almost this image of like the ribs of a building, like the tabernacle, if you have the ribs, that as long as you don't have women in the structure, then my argument was that you really don't have what I would call the fullness of the restoration. Anyway, that paper, which was kind of sensational when I gave it, because I said, Mormonism has more theological and historical justification for ordaining women than really any other Christian religion. It has more justification. And yet we've lagged behind all these other churches in what we've done. And then I wrote a lot more papers about that, which is really what led to my excommunication. But very early, when I gave that paper, there was all these arguments among Mormon feminists where they said, they sort of divided us into the good girls and the bad girls. I was one of the bad girls. So it was the idea, no, we can't ask for a priesthood. And a lot of women said, well, I don't even want priesthood. Yeah. No, we can't ask for a priesthood. Let's work for what they call the sort of baby steps. We're going to work for equality. Don't go to the top and ask for priesthood. Let's do other things like women praying in sacrament meeting or in general conference. That was a big deal. Or, being able to sit on the stand, or, when you give a talk, wearing pants to church, all of these things were like the baby steps. And you even have someone like Nyla McBain. I don't know if you know who she is, but she wrote a book about women in the church. And she's arguing, oh, you can do all of these really important things on a local structure. So this example of the Standoff Stand Down and Standoff is an example of that. Well, look, women can do these things. Their voices are heard on a local level. So she's saying where people should work is on the local level. Don't ask for the big structural changes. Well, of course, Ordained Women was asking for a big structural change. It was put down, even stronger. But I see, then interestingly, the church in 2019 starts trying to make these concessions to women. And it seems like a lot of people are arguing, look, the church is getting better. There is more equality for women now. But then we have this recent thing which shows no. And I would say the reason they don't want women sitting on the stand is it appears that they have church authority, which connects it to priesthood. And it's symbolically, they're not going to accept that. So anyway, I've sort of given my long interpretation, but I hope that can lead to us talking about this. But really, again, I see the bottom line is as long as women are not ordained to priesthood, they're always second-class citizens, no matter how much kind of little things you give them. Okay, you can pray in general conference. You can sit on the stand in general conference. You can be witnesses. You can do these other things, but really, you are not equal with the men. I mean, and they'll say, "Oh, but you're just as important." Well, structurally, you're not. And so I don't know. Let's talk about all of that stuff I just said.
No, I think exactly what you said. The infrastructure and the idea is kind of like window dressing or frosting. That's how I look at it, because there's nowhere in the entire church that any woman can make a decision that inevitably could not be overridden by, I guess, an 11-year-old boy with the priesthood, right? I mean, if you really get down to it. And I don't know if you saw recently, like you said, you don't watch it as much as your husband Paul does, but they put out an update in the handbook that gave the structure of what kind of leadership and numbers it needs to form a new ward or a new branch or a new group. And they had very specific number of priesthood holders, number of youth. Women were never listed anywhere on that list. It never said you're going to have at least 20 good women that can make funeral potatoes. They never said anything like that. It's all priesthood. It's all youth. It's all leadership callings, and once you've achieved that number of men, I think they lowered it. The big news about it was that it's so low, like you can really have these wards with only, I think, 20 male leadership roles that can function everywhere.
I was going to say, how many good men do we have to have a ward, right? Or
that's basically what this is. And again, you get kind of distracted by all these other things. Oh, look at women in leadership on missions. They're able to do this or they can do that. But then these things happen off the stand, or look, here's what it takes to make a ward. No mention of any female presence whatsoever. Well, and it made me realize you could have 1,000 women in a geographical area for a ward. But until you have one, I don't know, pimply faced 17-year-old boy with the Melchizedek priesthood, you don't have a ward. You can't form one. And that's kind of the dark side that people don't allow themselves, I think, to see.
No. And again, I think the little changes they've made are good, but they're not enough. They really, and I think your example is so good, Rebecca, because they have to have the male priesthood leadership. You could have 1,000 women, but if we can't find 20 good men, right, or even 20 mediocre men, right, we can't really form the structure of a ward. And that's really crucial because, and I argue this in the article we talked about last time, that this overall structure of the church, as you said, men make the decisions, they create doctrine, they manage the finances, and that everything that women do has to go through priesthood approval. Even though, again, they've sort of loosened up and it's not as bad as when I was young, but it's still very much, the structure of the priesthood. And even if you look at the visuals for general conference, maybe now the women are a little bit more visible, but if you count the numbers of the references of the men as opposed to the women, and the men are it's a pyramid structure, right? You have the president prophet and the counselors and the council of the 12 and the 70s and all of this male leadership. I mean, it is a pyramid hierarchical, and the men are at the top. They're the ones. I mean, even the fact that we do not have an example of a female prophet who is seen as having the spiritual authority and power. I mean, that's important. And I've argued this even with like the Heavenly Mother too, that in a way, she's in the same position, that you can say, oh, Heavenly Father, we have heavenly parents. Notice that you talk about heavenly parents more than Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. We don't name her, right? Oh, and she's too sacred to talk about. But the same thing, she is kind of on the sideline. It's sort of like the Godhead is looked as like the first presidency, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, a very male Holy Ghost. They're the ones that preside. Yeah, she's kind of there. But it's the same kind of structure, right? And so you see it modeled in the heavens as well as on earth, if you're talking Mormon theology. Yeah. So Landon, we should give you a chance to say something.
I was just going to say it was interesting to hear you say that, because in general conference, we hear all of the men are always deferring to President Nelson, and we quote from President Nelson. The women all defer to President Nelson and quote to President Nelson. When does anyone defer to a woman in the church and say, here's a woman who's doing, who does wonderful things, or sets a good example for us to look to? That never happens. We never point to a good woman. We only point to President Nelson or whoever the prophet is.
The very fact of how often we point to President Nelson is very disturbing. Because again, you have this very hierarchical, the structure, the ultimate authority is this man.
Alpha male. We're pointing to the alpha.
Yeah, the alpha male. That's exactly what it is. And I think it's really interesting. It's been a long time since I went to a church meeting, right? But I remember way back the last time I went to Relief Society, the manual had, the lessons all had a male general authority as sort of the center of the lesson. And his picture in the manual, sort of like, we women, we can't like talk about our own things or define our own, what we're concerned with. We have to have a talk by a male general authority that's going to be the outline for us for what we're going to talk about. I was so disturbed by that. And I don't know if they still do that, Rebecca, if you have more of a connection.
I have a story.
Tell us your story.
No, this reminds me of that exactly. One of the very last times I ever went to Relief Society. And I must have been there by accident. I swear I must have been visiting a relative or something. It couldn't have been, it was not my own
accidental visit.
Seriously, I think it was, you had to go, like one of your relatives said, well, you're coming in, aren't you, Rebecca? And you're like, okay. But they had us all in a big circle, which was different from what I was used to. And there was a man, someone on the High Council sitting there. And the Relief Society president said, Elder Brother so-and-so is here because we're going to have a conversation today about, women in the church and women's issues. And he is going to help us guide this. I know, I'm not making this up, guide this discussion. It was absolutely ridiculous. And he looked just as uncomfortable as everyone else. And he's like, well, sisters, what do you find to be an issue today? I just thought, oh my God, seriously, optically, you just can't even make this stuff up. It's just crazy. And I think about how
you can't make it up.
You can't make it up. And I think about recently, you see these mothers, younger mothers than when we were young mothers, who are really looking for female role models in the church for their daughters. It's extremely important. If we would have read that letter back there, that was part of it. I want my daughter and my son to see women, so that my sons grow up understanding, women are incredible. And so I see the church trying to, again, I hate to use the word lip service, but try to recreate the few female main characters that there are into these roles, but they rarely, if ever, give them any kind of power. For example, Emma, right? First of all, Emma was vilified for decades. When I was young, you don't mention Emma. No one knows exactly what happened to her. She's just out there somewhere. Now Emma is part of the world's greatest love story. That's who Emma is. That's who your daughter can emulate. She's part of this amazing love story, and she's so supportive.
Well, a monogamous marriage, right?
Yes, with a monogamous love story. And the main thing about her is that she's so supportive of her priesthood holder, right? So they try to show these women, but they're always in this role of, wonderful support.
Yeah, they've tried to rehabilitate her. Why don't you go back to that first slide where we can see if you had an all women thing, right? Is that the next one, going back to the very beginning again? Yeah, the great LDS
Yeah.
women standoff, and maybe we can look at that again, and then not use the PowerPoint because I kind of like to see your faces more. But I think that this is Rebecca, did you use AI to kind of produce
it was my
this?
husband actually that it's become his new hobby, and he makes our thumbnails. And I said, hey, I need some kind of AI. And it took us a while to be able to get it to understand what a stand is. There were some weird ones, but yeah. And then he said, well, let's make it fun. Let's make it Disney. Let's lighten the impact. I'm like, yeah, okay. But I think it makes it more impactful because they're all kind of like Disney princesses sitting there, aren't they? And then ordered off the stand. So,
well, and it's interesting that you could even argue that in the old days, the Relief Society had more, I'm not talking 19th century. I'm even talking when I was young in the 1970s. If you think about Belle Spafford, I mean, on one level, she's kind of conservative, but she was a strong lady. And the Relief Society had more power. After correlation, their money was taken away, their magazine was taken away. They had sort of an independent power. Well, certain people could argue, oh, well, we didn't want a separate kind of women's thing and a men's organization. We're going to combine them, which interestingly, after ordained women, they've now done with General Conference. But there's a way in which it also takes away from women's power. So it's sort of, it's telling and disturbing that we kind of then take away the Relief Society power, incorporate them more into the general body of the church, but they become even more subordinated on one level, which is disturbing.
That was one of the things I was concerned about on this whole thing is that, in General Conference, they allow the women presidencies up on the stand. Then now they say, no, you're not allowed to do that at the stake level or at the ward level. So, it's pretty easy to see that General Conference is widely televised. It's put out to the world. It's almost as if they're saying to the world, we welcome women. We put them in our stand. They're part of our leadership. But to their members, they're saying, oh, no, don't believe that. That's what we say to the world. That's not what really happens. You don't have any authority and you shouldn't be on the stand. It doesn't make sense that the very leadership can do exactly what the local leaders were doing. And it's wonderful. But when the local leaders do it, they get slapped down and told they better take care of this problem or they could lose their positions.
Yeah, it's
optic, I think that's a really important point. Yeah, Landon, that's a very important point. I don't know. I have another direction we could go, but if you guys have more comments, we could do that too. I wanted to talk about the rhetoric of equality that they seem to like to really, equality and partnership. They like to have that language that men and women are partners and that we believe in, equality of men and women. And yet the structures all argue against that. And I think they've used, so we can talk about the optics being kind of like a propaganda in a way, especially of General Conference. But also I think that there's a lot of rhetoric that's used to really cloud the picture of whether or not we really have a partnership between men and women or any kind of, is there equality? And that was kind of my bottom line. As long as the priesthood structure organizes everything, there really is never inequality. There's never equality. And so I would like to talk a little bit about that language. I think it's very interesting that after the ordained women movement, they first of all made some of those changes that, again, I think are great, but they don't go far enough. But also with the language, they'll talk about the partnership. And I think it's interesting if we look at Dallin Oaks way back in 2005, and I think he was responding to certain people like me who argue that Joseph Smith gave women priesthood keys. And he gave all these talks about, no, women have never had priesthood keys, right? And also he started this rhetoric, which then is kind of revived after ordained women and up to sort of this, new changes about the temple and so forth, where they will talk about equal partnerships. But Dallin Oaks made it very clear the equal partnership. He'll say, well, in the home, men and women have equal partnership, but in the church,
Yes.
we have, that the male priesthood kind of runs things. And he softened it a little bit, but it's like that. And then later, even President Nelson said stuff about, well, women have, and then they started this whole rhetoric of women have the authority and spirit of priesthood, but they don't have keys or offices. And again, I'm sort of saying and of course you only have the authority as long as you have a specific church calling. As soon as your calling is over, you don't have authority anymore. But it seems like they keep using this language to try to cover over the inequality. And yet I think I think that there's a way in which it's a sort of, it really does not reflect how things actually function. So I don't know if you have any response, Brandon or Rebecca, to that, if you've had any feel about that.
Yeah, I've noticed that. And maybe we should go to our last slide and then let's take the slides off so we can look each other in the face, right?
Okay, good.
Because I know when we talked to Margaret before on BYP's show, we talked a lot about, early keys and authorities that were there. So we can touch on that. But I was going to say, you made me think of, when I was still going to church, I would kind of relegate myself over to primary, and I was usually with the little 7, 8-year-olds. And you're right. The language that I saw about priesthood in the lesson manuals, even at that age, it was just this little, I don't know. It made everybody feel like it was one way, when those of us that are older know it was not that way. It would never be that way, to the point where I taught a lesson once, and I mentioned this on BYP's, where I had a class, there was only one little boy, the rest were little girls, and each one of them thought they were going to get the priesthood. They did not understand yet at age 7 that they would not be getting the priesthood like the boys.
We talked about that. I love that story, Rebecca.
I even had them raise my hand when one little girl said, I can't wait to get the priesthood. And someone else said, me too. And I said, how many of you think you're getting the priesthood? And they're all like, and the little boy sat there like this. He knew they weren't, but he wasn't going to say anything. And that tells me that parents younger than I am, are not telling their little girls about that. They're using this rhetoric that you're describing, where it sounds, just kind of dancing around it, but they're never going to come right out and say to the little girls, that's not going to be you. So I don't know. It's a different day. It's a different kind of, kids, different kinds of parents. And this rhetoric is for them to be able to dance around it. But long term, I don't think that's viable. What do you think, Landon?
I think that they're trying to dance around it. And one of the ways they've done that is the young women going on missions now. And that's become almost an expectation for the women. And then it looks like, oh, we've got equal young men and young women out there, therefore we're equal. Yet the young women can't baptize when they're out there. They can't, do any of the things that are needed in a ward, as we just talked about, that you have to have certain qualifications to have a ward. They can't run branches out there. And so
they better make I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying they're definitely skirting around the issue. Skirting's maybe a bad word in this case.
Bad word, Landon.
But I was thinking, and it just amazes me that, obviously we can look at the three of us and you can say, oh, there's 2 women there and a guy. But as I step back and looking at this, I'm going, because Rebecca and I have talked about this, how much the church loses by not allowing the women brain trust to be utilized in the church. If you're a PhD in accounting, you still can't be the ward clerk because you don't have priesthood. What if instead of our pictures here, we had our brain is what showed up on here? You wouldn't be able to tell the men from the women from the brain, because we all think and we all have something we can add. But we take this, physical body, and that determines what you can do, when we all know it's the brain trust that's really what's important and what leads and what makes a leader. And yet we take half of those brains and just throw them to the side and say they don't count because they're in this physical body that looks like this. Just absurd.
Yeah. Yeah. And I so agree with you, Landon, that the church is losing so much by not utilizing women's talents and so forth. I mean, even if you think about in the first presidency, if you had women who didn't have to vote with their husband, but they were in the first presidency and they could have their silent vote, how much they would go, that is ridiculous, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I have a very funny story of way back when I was an undergrad at BYU, and you're both way too young, but maybe historically you know that Joseph Fielding Smith was married to this, she was like his second wife, I think, Jessie Evans Smith, and she was this really strong woman. And there was a devotional where he gave a talk and he had all these strong things that he said. And she got up, and maybe I'm remembering wrong that this was a private one, but she basically, he had all these strict rules about how you should dress and this and that. And after he gave his talk, she gave a talk and she goes, "Oh, we girls, we know that." She basically contradicted him, everything he said, and said, "Well, that's a man's perspective, but we girls know that we need this and that. We need our makeup. We need this. We have things, don't believe all those kind of strict rules from the old patriarch."
Wow.
I couldn't believe that she said that in a public meeting, but
I wonder what happened when they went home. I can only imagine.
I think he was afraid of her, quite frankly.
Good. Oh my gosh.
She was a singer, and she would always, sing whenever they were invited to come someplace. And my husband likes to laugh that she was like the only female baritone in the church. She had this really deep voice. But, I mean, it's a kind of a little, this memory, but you think about if the women really had a voice, and they didn't have to feel like they had to sustain their husbands, how would certain policies be different?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you guys ever talked about some of the controversy over garments for women.
Yeah. That
whole thing where women were complaining that the garments were not good for their physical health.
Mm-hmm.
They were getting infections. Mm-hmm. And of course, my immediate response was, yeah, there's some kind of, it's really about money. The church made some deal with some, fabric company, and they make China. Them, and they're not gonna go back about, who cares about women's health until you make it public, and then church is embarrassed, right? But if you think about, if women had been in charge, where they're the ones who are saying, yeah, we wear them and they're really uncomfortable and there's a problem here, but you have some decision made above that women's voices are not really heard.
Yeah, and it's a travesty to me. And I had this conversation with someone about the Salt Lake Temple and what they've done to that, which is just destroy it completely.
Oh, I know.
And
I'm so upset about it.
Everyone's extremely upset. And this person is a archivist and a preservationist and is really into architecture. And he said, if there were any women's voices in any of that decision making, which was, I believe, just a corporate, right down the line, no consideration to the arts or the beauty or the history or the meaning, any women's voices in there, they would have said, slow down. You don't understand what this means and what this is. There's a yin and a yang. There is. And the men in the church have siloed themselves to such an extent that they're missing an entire half of everything that could give such great input and come out with solutions and workable answers, but they just don't. They completely turn it off. And you see things like that, the garments, you see things like destroying artwork and architecture, and you just think, where are the voices that are protecting those? And even in the first presidency and the apostles, artists or poets or anybody that would see another perspective. You just need that.
Right. And I mean, I think that in addition to what you're saying, which I totally agree, that women's perspectives are not at all valued. But even if you think about the fact that the leaders clone themselves. Mm-hmm. So, when they choose new leaders, they're not going to choose the leader who is the artist, the humanities kind of guy. Mm-hmm. They're going to choose someone who's a successful businessman, right?
Yeah. So
that they're not, they're not even using the best talents of the men, right? Because they have a model of what leadership should look like, and it's very corporate. And so you can just look and see. I mean, I think about my own father. He was such a good man, but not at all, he was not the successful businessman. He was a very gentle sort of soul. He never had a priesthood leadership position. Yeah. But he was the most faithful person. He was always there, putting up the chairs, taking down the chairs, doing the service, but he would not be called because he was not this, alpha successful businessman. And so it's so sad on so many levels, that, what is valued because of not just the male priesthood structure, but the corporate structure of the church that thinks more about money, as though they need more money, right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's like, can't we preserve the art? Can't we preserve the history? Of course, I think they want to whitewash and destroy the history. We don't want to see
there's an ulterior motive.
Right. But it's really sad, that we have this overall. And I mean, it's so, I'm going to use the word sad again, but it's so sad that they've made this big issue out of something that shouldn't be a big issue of women sitting on the stand. Who was threatened by that? There must have been somebody who said, oh, that looks too much like women have priesthood authority. They have authority, right? We can't have the women be this visible sign of authority. So we better remove them off the stand. I mean, if you think about, I'm thinking of my youth growing up too. I mean, it used to be that, you'd have the bishopric sitting up there, but you'd also have everybody who was going to give a talk, and you'd have the chorister, the organist. I mean, there was the sort of priesthood male right there at the front, but it's like, why can't they even let women have a little bit of authority? Why do they have to take even a little bit that they've given away, given in the past? Now they're going to take it away. So,
and that's the issue. And it's going to end up being bigger than they think. I think already they're really surprised at how, going back to the corporate, Landon, remember this, we'll laugh. In Florida, we connected with some missionaries that were down there. They went out to dinner with us, actually. And we asked them, so tell us about your mission president. And they said, he's a hedge fund manager from Salt Lake. He's worth $3.1 billion. And he, and they were just thrilled over him. That was his credential. And these boys were just in awe. And, the business is just corporate like that. But we also attended a Bickertonight service, if you're familiar with the Bickertonites that kind of come down through Sidney Rigdon. And it was interesting to us because they, we thought, well, this is an interesting example because, it's early church. It kind of has roots back there. So they did have a very large male presence on the stand. They let women come up and dress the sacrament table. They were able to put the sheet on or the tablecloth, and they were able to prepare that. Then they sat back down, and then the rest of it was very male. So, I would think that most branches of the Restoration, I think maybe Community of Christ has made some strides in that way. They do have ordained apostles and leaders, but, it's a restoration. It's a hallmark of the Restoration, right?
The community of
We've recently been reading some of Sidney Rigdon's when he left the church, and he actually made Phoebe a prophetess the one that he ended up running. So
Children of Zion.
There is some indication that the early leaders were supportive of women having these type of leadership positions. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that example, Rebecca, of the women could kind of dress the sacrament table.
Make it all nice.
There's this constant thing about, what can women do that doesn't encroach upon priesthood authority? Because again, I think that's the central issue. They're worried about women and, somehow taking away from the male priesthood. It seems like this goes back to some real fear about women's power. I remember way back in the year the September 6, 1993, where we had the purge of intellectual scholars and feminists, where I was the one that was first threatened even before my husband. And I was called in by the bishop. I was called in by the stake president. And I remember the bishop saying to me, and he was actually a really lovely man. I liked him. He did not actually hold a church court on me, which was one of the reasons that they waited for a while before I was exed. He didn't want to do that. I thought he was a compassionate, good man. But he said to me after he read one of my articles about women in priesthood, he said, I don't know. I'm just afraid that if women had priesthood, they would completely dominate the men. Women are so strong and they're so good at what they do. And men, they need priesthood because, otherwise they'll just be out, doing, who knows what. but he just
Strip
felt like
clubs,
that. Oh, we
bars,
can't
that's what
have.
everyone thinks. Yeah, that's where
Yeah,
most
maybe they'd
club
be off in
bars.
the bar.
It all
I was
ends up
thinking
there.
that they're going to be off playing sports, right? They'll be doing basketball in the cultural hall. He was just, and it was interesting to see from even him, who I thought was very open and not a authoritarian type of person. And in fact, he was like an architectural historian or something. He was not like the business person at all, but he was just afraid of women dominating. And it's interesting. He was raised by a single mom whom he really admired, and she was very strong. But he thought, yeah, we have to worry because we men, we're just going to be outpowered by the women.
Yeah, so I don't have to be hobbled.
I'll say one of the great blessings of post-Mormondom is that I've got to meet so many brilliant women who had I didn't meet brilliant women in the church because they're not allowed to speak, but they were there because obviously you two are a perfect example of that. And as I've met so many women that are just brilliant, I'm just going, oh my gosh, we really messed up there by not including that brain trust, because there really are some bright women out there. And when you compare the compassion that most women have and throw that on with the brilliance, you just go, wow, that's next level in teaching people on what you want, a Christ-like attitude, you know? Mm-hmm. So.
Well, and I just think we have so much to share with each other. The idea that we're going to separate everybody, we have the male priesthood and then women kind of do their things. It really, it creates a dysfunction on every single level. Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back to what you were saying, Rebecca, about, you know, the letter that these women sent to leaders, that I think really the sad thing too is that girls do not have they do not see role models, right? They do not see women in positions of authority. They don't see women, you know, scholars, teachers. They don't see this in the church. And, you know, the younger women are not putting up with this. There are more and more young women who just leave. I mean, it's like, there's nothing for me here. You know, in the workplace, I am valued for my skills and my intelligence. But in church, you know, I can hand out towels, right? And they girls see it. It's not like they don't see it. I mean, I love that story again of yours, Rebecca, about
they were fierce.
Yeah, I want priesthood.
Little girls were fierce. I'm telling you, everybody needs to watch out. They're not going to put up with that. So
no, and again, the church is losing so much because they are losing young women. You know, the young women, they see it very clearly. Yep. That there's a big division between what happens in the regular world versus what happens in the church.
Exactly. And I saw that with, I believe, the parents of these little girls at home were telling them they could do anything a boy could do. They could do sky is the limit. And yet they couldn't bring themselves to say, but not in this organization. And I think when you say the women are so more important than anyone realizes, because the church kind of uses them as the gateway to the boys, if that makes sense, to draw them in, to keep them in. I mean, in my own family, I have, you know, a son that was not really considering a mission and then, you know, connected with a girlfriend and her family. And I really see that. And I think the church sees that too as a gateway to control, influence the boys. I don't know if you guys have noticed something like that, but I noticed that a lot, that the women are pretty much taught this is what you should expect of your partner. And so you're going to keep them in line and you're going to keep them in. So they should give more, I don't know, credence to that. I don't know. I wonder, I know in our discussion with BYP, you talked a little bit about the early church, and what you kind of described to us is more power. I mean, more authority, which has basically been wrung out of it at this point. But I think maybe our viewers and listeners might be interested in knowing a little bit about that. Just
right. And so to me, there are, again, we discussed this before in my article that was a critique of the church essay. As I did my historical research, and this is what got me in trouble initially, was that I looked at the speeches of Joseph Smith to the Female Relief Society in Nauvoo, where he's promising them, he's saying, I'm turning this priesthood key over to you. You're going to have, I'm going to introduce you into the priesthood, using very priesthood language. And of course, the church essay tries to deny that any of that really was about priesthood. they said, no, Joseph Smith he didn't teach anything that wasn't exactly what we do today, that he was just using language, loosely. He talked about the Relief Society being organized in the structure of the priesthood. And then importantly, he also organized, and he saw the temple endowment as bestowing priesthood upon women, which I think that if you look at it, there is so much priesthood language. And again, they try to say, oh, that has nothing to do with ecclesiastical priesthood or real priesthood. It's only about temple ceilings. But he also organized, in almost the last year of his life, he organized a group called the Anointed Quorum, the Holy Order, where both men and women met together, and it was called a priesthood quorum. And it didn't last very long. And there's no evidence, we don't have the minutes to see. I don't think women ever said anything in the meeting. So it's not as though everything was changed, but from my perspective, the thing that's important about it is that historically and theologically, you can use and there are many more statements of Joseph Smith that I quote in my article. The article is in a book called Scholars Respond to the LDS Gospel Topics Essays, and I have everything documented in there. So, I mean, you can't say that it was just like it changed everything, but I think it laid a theological and historical precedence for women being part of the priesthood structure. Then I also, in this article, go on to talk about how the women who were there at the foundation of the Relief Society and who were endowed and part of the Holy Order, that women like Bathsheba Smith and Sarah Melissa Granger and others, Eliza Snow, they saw themselves as priestesses, and they knew that Joseph Smith had promised them something, and they felt that the Relief Society was the place where they were going to exercise these gifts. Well, you have a series of movements by the leaders where they redefined everything and went backwards about any of those promises that Joseph Smith had made to the Relief Society. And by the time you get to like 1920, everything had changed. And interestingly, though, the Relief Society still had this independent power basically until correlation in the 1970s. They did have their own money. They had their own magazine, but then that was taken away. And you've sort of had, more and more power was taken away. But then I think it's very fascinating if I look at the whole history, starting in basically, I think, around the time of the ordained women movement, the church makes changes that seem to give women more again, saying that they say you can have authority and power of the priest, but you don't have keys or offices. They say you could be witnesses. And even the changes in the temple, I think it's very fascinating that they took away the idea that women had to be obedient to the husband. I'm glad they did that.
Yes.
But really, if you look at their other changes, it's still, even like the marriage ceremony was changed a little bit. I mean, I don't have the exact language, but the way they changed that, though, it was a little bit more equal, like an equal partnership, but you still have the man presiding.
Yeah.
And so they've kind of thrown out these things to say, oh, we believe in these equal partnerships, but really it's, again, men presiding. And because men have the priesthood. And that's why I always say the bottom line is that as long as women don't have priesthood, they're always second-class citizens. Yeah. So I guess, you could argue that in the history of the church, again, we have a theological and historical precedence for saying, for disagreeing with somebody like Gordon Hinckley, who said, God has always at all times only given priesthood to men. Mm-hmm. And this is the eternal pattern. It's God's will. We're not going to change that. Priesthood only belongs to men. And I'm saying, well, whatever else you can say negative about Joseph Smith, there is this historical evidence that he had a very different view about women having priesthood and being part of a structure. but it was only a very beginning, because not long after that, of course, he was killed, and Brigham Young quickly tried to walk back on all of that.
Of course.
And, I would say there was kind of a fight between, and I talk about this in my article, a fight between those women who, Bathsheba Smith said, Joseph Smith gave us everything. He gave us all this, he made us priestesses. He gave us all of this stuff. The Relief Society is supposed to be this priesthood organization for women. And then the men make them back down on everything. And by 1920, it has changed. But I think it's still the issue. And I've always that was the thing that got me in trouble. I mean, Boyd Packer was the one who told my stake president to hold a court on me. My husband too. This was in 93. I sometimes joke that maybe nobody else really understood what I said in Strangers in Paradox, but I think Boyd Packer understood it perfectly well. I think he knew that, that there was a foundation there for changing the position of women in the church, and I needed to be out. My leaders were told that, you need to. Well, finally the High Council Court, by the way, it was a High Council Court who tried me and excommunicated me, and they said to me directly, "We need to excommunicate you so that nobody will believe you." And so, in fact, it's interesting that I was excommunicated on November 30th, 2000. So 23 years ago, just barely celebrated that. But so, I mean, I'm not claiming that. So I'm not claiming that, that it was perfect in Joseph Smith's day.
No,
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's so many statements, which I document in my article, and so many things that were done that set a theological and historical precedence for a different structure of the church. And that immediately the male leaders after his death wanted to, deny all of that. And they've on and on, so the latest is this Gospel Topics essay where they say, well, yeah, if you look at the lectures of Joseph Smith to the Relief Society, it sounds like he's promising them priesthood, but really it's not really. He's just using language lightly, and he believed exactly what we believe now. So I don't know if that helps, Rebecca, but
that's wonderful. I love that overview, and you're exactly right. There's a path there if somebody wanted to explore that. There is a path doctrinally to make this happen. But Boyd K. Packer, he's showing all of us, you don't go down that path, and you slap down everybody that even brings that path up. So, and I think I see women, having obviously been a woman in the church, I see them having to just, learn to do workarounds and kind of cajole and trick, like, oh, we've got this budget for primary. Okay, I'll go into the bishop. He's in a bad mood after sacrament meeting, but later I'll go in and I'll see if we can get this through. I think that plays into the primary voice. I think it plays into the whole keep sweet, where you're just, that you're a second-class citizen, and that to even get anything done, you have to play this role. And it's just so sad. And I think, have you heard of Faith Matters Restore? It's kind of how would you describe it, Landon? It's sort of a growing group of kind of progressive Mormons who have a lot of really awesome ideas about equality and things like that. They meet, they have groups and symposiums and things like that. And then, of course, they're still part of their normal wards and branches, but they have these ideas of equality, and there's a chance, and someday it's going to change. I mean, is that kind of part of the cycle that you've seen? You have these things happen, and then maybe they make a push, and then they're kind of pushed back down. Is it cyclical? Will it just keep going? I mean, that's kind of what I've seen from what you're describing.
Right. No, Rebecca, excuse me, I've heard a little bit about that group, and I think it's exactly the pattern I've talked about. That when you look at younger people, and I really think that part of the problem is the leadership is these old men who don't want changes.
Yeah.
And if you had actually younger men, even let's say younger, 50 and younger.
Define young. Yeah, 65.
Well, I mean, yeah. 50 or younger, I think that they would be more open to changes. And for me, that's the hope, that if we can just get some of these old guys to die. I should, we can pray for that. But I don't know. The problem is that even the younger leaders, again, they clone themselves. So they pick new leaders that you aren't chosen as a mission president unless you're a successful business person. You're not chosen to be one of the new, leaders unless you're going to follow the pattern that they want you to follow. But I actually have hope that eventually there'll be some changes, that you have enough younger people, progressive Mormons. There are more of them than you think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, I've seen the cycles over and over again. And I think there are younger people who do want to see changes. They don't like the church being the way it is. They don't like the misogyny. I mean, the upper leaders are misogynistic. They don't like the misogyny. They don't like the racism. They don't like the homophobia. They don't like all these policies against LGBTQ people. You're seeing this happening at BYU, obviously.
Yeah.
The church has come down hard on, we want BYU to be orthodox, but you have professors who do not agree with this, and they have to be silent now. But I think things will change. I am hopeful, because I just think that there are a lot of younger people that I talk to, who do not agree with this. And even if you think about believers, this doesn't go along with their view of a compassionate, good God.
Mm-hmm.
They can't, it's hard to believe that God, that God goes along with this. It's funny, I published an article clear back in 2004 that was called "Are Boys More Important Than Girls?" And this it was an example from my sister's ward, where it's funny, the woman gave a talk about this. My son asked me when he saw all the priesthood, does Heavenly Father like boys more than girls? Because only the boys get the priesthood. So this is a little boy asking this, and this is back in 2004. And the mother was trying to say, well, no, honey, God really does love us all. And she did this at a testimony meeting as though her answer to the son was faith promoting, rather than seeing it as kind of appalling, right? A little boy can see that, boys must be more important than girls, because the boys hold the priesthood, they do the sacrament, all of this. But I think that people see it, and, it's like, does God love, why does God only want a man to be the prophet, right? Don't women have prophetic voices? Don't they have important things to say? So I'm hopeful that things will change. But unfortunately, Rebecca, I think that we'll have more waves of putting things down. And that's why for me, this example of the, stand down from the pulpit, right?
Yeah.
That it's a sign of that cycle. But I think eventually people will just get tired of it. I mean, if you think about the two big voices that I've seen as trying to promote this false idea of equality, is Dallin Oaks and President Nelson.
Yep.
They're the two big voices of, oh yeah, things are great. There are a couple of talks, and another thing I wrote, I quoted one from Nelson, where, he's acting as though there's all this equality, at the same time that it was in the session where he said, let's have the men all stand up according to their priesthood office. Yeah. And they went kind of like you do in a solemn assembly. It was like, really? You're trying to claim that women have sort of equal partnership, but you're honoring all the men with priesthood at the same time? So I don't know. We'll see. But unfortunately, it seems like it's just going to happen really slowly.
And who's it, Holland, that said the church is always 20 years behind, and they are, but eventually the gap is so huge that you have to take notice, because you look like a freaky fundamentalist cult if you don't, you know what I mean? It's
and actually
difference.
Yeah, they don't want that. I mean, I remember way back with Gordon B. Hinckley, I think it was in his interview with Mike Wallace, where he made this great statement where he goes, "We are not weird." And
tell yourself that.
Tell yourself that. And that, actually, I think he was one of the better presidents. Yeah. And he was kind of pragmatic and so forth. But I don't think the church, they don't want to look like weird fundamentalists. They don't want to be weird, eccentric. They want to be mainstream American. And even mainstream Christian, although I think there's a real problem there with trying to, they have given too much into the evangelicals.
Yeah.
But
and yet they're
so go ahead, Landon.
They're one of the institutions that will always take a step backwards when everyone else is stepping forward. And this is a perfect example of that. When you think they're maybe going the right direction, they take a step backwards and say, nope, we're not going where you thought we were going. And everyone just goes, what? And I think they hurt themselves when they do that. And I think this is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
It really is. And like I said, in 2019, it seemed like they were moving in a direction. We're going to change language in the temple. Women can be witnesses. We're kind of moving toward what could be more of an equal partnership. And then suddenly they do this.
Yeah.
And in a sneaky way, that's the part that's also disturbing, is that it's sneaky. And they leave themselves room to deny that they really even did that, so that maybe they could change later if they need.
Which tells you they know it's stupid.
They know, that's right. Yep.
Yeah, they do know it's stupid. And yeah, I mean, I just think that they're, because of the soul hierarchy of the church, I mean, it's like the way in which Nelson made this crazy thing about making the word Mormon like it's an evil word.
Mm-hmm.
That makes me so upset on so many levels. But because of he's in the position he is, even though people know that it's stupid, or even to try to say, we've got to say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints instead of LDS. I mean, nobody's going to say that long name, right? It's stupid, but nobody can contradict him. I mean, it's like the emperor, you know, the emperor going naked, right?
That's right.
No one's going to say, President Nelson, that's a really stupid idea.
No, but they have to do it. And now they've set in place that the words of prophets, once they pass away, are kind of null and void. You don't pay attention, right? They don't age well, like classic cars and comic books, which means that as soon as the next prophet is in, he can say, well, now we'll do this. That just leaves people in the wind. And that's maybe a funnier or a lighter example. But then you have something like the November 15th policy, right? People inherently did not, they knew that was horrific, yet my prophet said I have to do it, oh, it's repealed. Okay, now it just leaves people in this giant hot mess, this muddle, nobody's really doing what their conscience is telling them. But I really liked what you kept reminding us of before an hour ago, where you talked about the men that are champions here. I think that would be a good thing to talk about as we kind of conclude, because I agree the women are progressing, the women are seeing it, but the men are seeing it too. And these boys are raised by women, and they're going to be a huge part of it too. A lot of people that I noticed that we talked to with the standoff, they were men saying, I don't agree with this. I don't like this. How dare you do this? So what role do you see men playing in this as we go forward, hopefully change?
Yeah. And I think it's really important for men who are in leadership positions to, even if they do it in subtle ways, so they don't seem to be, defying the leadership, but they in subtle ways reinstate women's power and consult women and raise up women. If men are willing to do that, I think it makes a huge difference. And I agree with you. I just think there's so many men who really do not like this kind of authoritarian, and they don't agree with the second-class citizenship of women, and they want changes. So people have to, I know you can't be as bold as I have been in the past or even now, but if you can think of more subtle ways of empowering women and trying to create on a local level more of an atmosphere of inclusion, I think it makes a huge difference. And
that's exactly what they just did here, and they got slapped down. And that's why the men need to stand up at this point.
Yeah.
And say, hey, you didn't give me a written policy. There is no written policy. So if you're going to say I get to make the letter, I'm going to write the letter the way I feel, because you gave me no direction.
I love that, Landon. I agree. Have a bishop say, okay, it's up to me, or a state president say, it's up to me. I think it's fine for women to be on the stand, because I want there to be role models for all of our young women. I want our young women to know that we value women equally with men, and that we don't see men as somehow they're always in charge and they're always right. They don't have to be that bold in saying that, but just to say that we need models for our young women so that they know that we value women in the church. Mm-hmm. You're right, Landon. There is room here. And the very fact, and it's so ironic, because they don't want to take responsibility and they won't say that they don't like it, they have given some leeway to local leaders. And I think men should stand up for the women. And, it's really interesting because I've spoken so much on women being ordained and women having priesthood. Over the years, I've often had more men that agree with me than women. And because I think women are sometimes afraid that if they say, I think women should be ordained, that they think that they're seen as power hungry. Yeah. And so they will not say it boldly. But if a man says it, he's not seen as being, outrageous or power hungry. If he says, yeah, I think women should be ordained. So I think men can have a very important role in promoting more actual equality in the church rather than just this kind of surface thing too, that there's a lot they can do. And I think it's really important. And I think men will, I hope that they will do it.
I've seen too many men just shed that responsibility and say, well, that's what my leader told me. Mm-hmm. If you're a leader in the church and you're a leader whose responsibility it is to take a moral stand when you see something wrong, then for heaven's sakes, take a moral stand. Yeah. You don't just bend over. You may get kicked out. That's fine. But you took the stand. That's what you're supposed to do when you're a religious moral leader. And that's what you've been called to do. So do it. Stand up to it. And that's what I'm not seeing. If you're going to make the women stand down, it's time for you to stand up. So
I love that. I totally agree.
Slogan. That's awesome, Landon.
That's a great slogan. We need to make a meme, right? So. Get your husband on this, Rebecca.
That's right. That's right.
No, this is really important. And in fact, I would say that even if we're not talking women's issues, to me, this is a central problem in the church. People act against their own moral conscience. Mm-hmm. Because they are told that the more important thing is that they're obedient to leaders. And yet they know in their hearts, there so many times on lots of different issues, certainly with a lot of the LGBTQ and especially how children are treated, it was so obvious to people that there was something morally wrong about what was being done. But because you're told, obedience is the first law of heaven. And I go, yeah, obedience to God and your conscience, not to leaders. That's right. And yet I think that the most important thing, we're going to be judged on our own actions and what we do. Not that I believe in a judgmental God. Yeah. But I mean, just if you're thinking about in this idea in general, it's your own conscience, it's your own actions. The idea that you're just going to defer to somebody else, that's destructive. That's how you have, major, if you think about, Nazi Germany, and it was different there because there were consequences. You could be beheaded or, put into the concentration camps if you disagreed. That's not the consequences we have. So the fact that people are not more courageous is disturbing to me because they can excommunicate you as they did to me because they told me, they said, you can believe whatever you want. You just can't say any of this stuff in public, right? But I go, no, if I can't speak my conscience in public, then there's something very wrong. To me, that's the most central thing, is that a person has to act according to her conscience and his conscience and their consciences and so forth, because that is the basis of moral action. Like you said, Landon, I really like what you said.
Yeah, it was great. We're going to make a bumper sticker. And I think that it can make a difference. I think of protecting children in the LDS church. I think of somebody like a Sam Young, a bishop that said, no, this is not going to happen. I personally have a relative that was a bishop that said, I am not going to interview youth like that anymore. I mean, people are standing up saying, this is not right. I'm going to have my door open. I'm going, you see these things, you can make a change. I mean, it may be a personal risk. You could get disciplined. There could be a problem, but if you feel it, you need to do it. And enough do. then changes happen, as we saw with, little bit of moving the needle on child protection. So I think it makes a difference, and I think women, sometimes we feel like, oh, the patriarchy, we don't need them to give us power in the church. We all have to work together. We just have to. It's the system that there is, so you have to come around to it together, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Very important for people to take individual responsibility, because that the individual action or speaking out, in some meeting or something where things are moving in a direction that makes you uncomfortable. It's hard, but I think it makes a difference. I used to have that happen to me where I'd speak out in some, church meeting and Relief Society or Sunday school, and afterwards I'd have people come up to me in the hall. I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad. They're afraid to.
Right.
But if somebody will speak out, I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Or even a little difference, but a lot of little differences make a big difference in the long run. Right?
That's it. And I think that's how you have to navigate the structure of the church. That's just how it's set up. But you can historically look at big changes that happen from little steps from people. So, wow, this has just been an amazing conversation. I feel like we could keep talking for hours. It's been awesome. Landon, do you have any final thoughts on this? This has been really, really impactful for me.
I just don't see the gender thing being why it should be an issue, because Margaret Toscano's got bigger balls than all the rest of the leaders in the church. So,
wow. Okay, that's a bumper sticker too.
To
maybe
stand up and say what needs to be said.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it.
So, good for you, Margaret.
And that's why we're so honored to have you on. That was just wonderful.
Well, I just love talking.
Oh,
I love talking to you guys. It's been both times. It's been really fun, and I love the kind of interaction and so forth. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, we're so happy. And we're going to have you back again. There are these issues that you're always the perfect person to discuss with. But we want to remind everybody that Margaret and her husband, Paul, are going to be on Mormonism Live, because this will air Monday. So you'll all be watching it Monday. And then Wednesday at 6:20 p.m. Mountain Time. This is going to be fantastic. I've talked to RFM about this, and he is beyond thrilled to have you guys on. He said, these are my people. This is going to be just wonderful. So it's going to be a really great episode of Mormonism. Here I am promoting another show on my show, but I don't care, because we're all in the same boat together. It's awesome. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. And please comment. Let us know what you think about the taking a stand on, stand off, all of that. Have you experienced any of the things that we've talked about in your own wards? Just please comment and let us know about what you thought of Margaret's thoughts and just everything we talked about. And of course, like and subscribe to Mormonish. And if you'd like to be made aware of when our new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell and it'll let you know when the new ones drop. And if you'd like to financially support Mormonish, we have links in the show notes to PayPal or to Venmo if you'd like to help us financially. And again, just thank you so much, everybody, and happy holidays too to everyone if we don't talk again before the end of the year. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for Mormonish. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.